Dear Mr. Pontin, we are happy to welcome you as a special guest shortly before the 2013 Open Innovations Forum. Thank you for finding time to answer our questions. The first question would be, we know that MIT Technology Review is conducting a research on emerging themes. Could you please briefly tell us about this report?
Well, I myself have not yet read the whole report, but I was very involved in setting up the charter by which it would be written, researched, and produced. So I kind of know what it's going to say. Its most important insights will be to describe the 10 or so most important technologies that will be driving global markets over the next 3 to 5 years. And then it wants to do a couple of extra things. It wants to describe in some detail what the market forces are that drive the development and the commercialization of innovations. And then finally, it wants to do something very specific for Russia also. Russia is a country in extraordinary transition. I know it wishes to become part of the innovation economy in a real way. And the Emerging Trends report hopes to at least provide some intelligence about what Russia's next steps should be.
So, which emerging technologies will have the greatest impact on the global market?
So every year MIT Technology Review identifies the 10 most important technologies that we think will transform the world. And I don't want to select just one or two of them. We have equal affection for all our children. But if I have to select just a few, let me give a few suggestions. I think the impact of what is called deep learning, which is a branch of artificial intelligence, will be very important. The whole tradition of computing essentially began with the hope of artificial intelligence, and yet nothing really happened for decade after decade after decade. Just recently, though, because of perhaps the sheer weight of computing power we could bring to the problem of artificial intelligence, plus some real breakthroughs in computer science, it looks like we can begin to do kinds of deep pattern recognition, which hitherto only human beings could perform. So one big trend in technology at the moment, I think, is the rebirth, the renaissance of artificial intelligence. A second trend in IT, which I know your audience will have heard about, is big data. So big data is the trend where these volumes, this sea of information that we are constantly generating and accessing, can be really analyzed in real time to create actionable intelligence, not just for companies, but for governments and for individuals as well. Big data can provide very surprising, very startling insights into human nature, and maybe I'll just suggest one. There's a woman called Carolyn Buckey who applies big data to epidemiological problems, disease problems in poor nations. And by using big data analysis, she has been able to predict outbreaks of famine or dengue fever or malaria before they occur, because it turns out that human behavior is very predictable when looked at the aggregate. And if I can just choose one last technology, I wish I could tell you that there would be a big breakthrough in energy in the next few years. Perhaps the great moral challenge of our age is how we will provide clean, sustainable energy to the 9 billion people who will be on the planet by the end of the century. But the truth is that at the moment less than 1% of global energy output derives from advanced renewable sources like natural gas and coal and petroleum. And the reason is purely cost. No existing alternative energy source can compete with the great natural resources that Russia has in abundance and that exist in other parts of the world also. So for the next few years, nations like Russia that have this wonderful resource, natural gas, are going to have essentially gold in their pockets. And that's both a great thing for Russia, but it's also a challenge for the whole world. What we need to do is to develop new alternative energy sources that can compete on price without subsidies from the government. And I don't think we're anywhere near that.
So which changes on the global innovation market can we expect in the nearest future and which in longer term?
So you're asking me essentially not about the new technologies themselves, but about the innovation markets as they exist to create new technologies. Here's an interesting thing with the global innovation market. It's not in a particularly healthy state. So the market that creates new technologies is itself not particularly healthy. And that's because the mechanisms which traditionally funded new technologies, innovations, are broken at the moment. Venture capital, the principal mechanism by which innovations are funded, is underwater financially and has been underwater for a decade or so. And at the same time, entrepreneurs don't need as much money or the same kinds of money from investors. So what's emerging in its place are new forms of funding. And I think Russia has extraordinary opportunities here. Some of those new kinds of funding might be crowdsourcing, the most famous example of which is Kickstarter. Other forms of funding and launching new technologies might come from incubators or what are sometimes called super angels. But I think there's also a role for governments to not just fund basic research and applied research, but also appropriately and in a hands-off, independent way to get into the game of venture capital itself. So I know this is one of the things that the Skolkovo Foundation has been very involved in, and I think for a nation like Russia that doesn't yet have a established venture capital community of the same sophistication and size, which the United States has, appropriate, as I say, hands-off funding of new technologies has a lot of opportunity at the moment. You asked about long-term challenges. I think the long-term challenge and change will be the decline of the United States as the sole hyperpower in the innovation economy. Silicon Valley used to be the engine house of the world for new ideas. I travel a great deal, and I no longer think that's the case, whether or not the United States knows it anymore. In the past, venture capitalists in Stanford and Berkeley would work to create new startups, and those companies came out of a single place. And now in my travels, I see amazing kids, both women and men, in countries as different as Pakistan, as Lebanon, as Greece, where I just came from, and here in Russia. We face global challenges as a species, global challenges, and the solutions of the future cannot come any longer from 100 square miles in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that's the great change that I think is coming over the world, and what I write about and think about, which are the creation of new technologies that meet the needs of Russians, of Chinese, of Greeks, of Pakistanis, and perhaps can provide ideas to the whole world.
So what do you expect from the 2013 Open Innovations Forum? And what are your wishes for the participants of the forum?
My principal wish for the participants in the forum is they should have a great time. And they should come away surprised and delighted by what they learn. But I have more serious and substantive wishes as well. One of the wishes in working to create the programming for the forum was to bring an extraordinary group of people here to Russia to see what Russia has to offer, to see the quality of Russian innovation and research and technology. So if we did nothing else but bring people here, I think that would be an extraordinary achievement. But we wanted to do more than that. We wanted to educate the attendees about what we thought were the most important and compelling new technologies and innovations on the planet at the moment. We wanted to identify both their opportunities and the challenges in commercializing these new technologies. And then finally, we had a wish very specific to Russia as well. We also want to be involved in what we can do to make Russia a contributing and important part of the global innovation economy.
So what is Russia good at, and what still has to be improved and worked on?
So Russia is an extraordinary country in so many ways. I think Russia has most of the core ingredients to become part of the global innovation economy, to be more than a part, to be a dominant player in that global economy. It's got extraordinary universities, some of the greatest technical universities in the world. It has a 200-year tradition of extraordinary achievements in basic and applied science. It has a mathematically and engineering educated young population. And finally, it has a government who has committed not just its dollars, but its heart and its policies to doing the best it can to encourage the development of an innovation economy. There are things that Russia is less good at, though. Russians are great entrepreneurs and they're great researchers, but getting the research into the marketplace doesn't really exist in a sophisticated way at the moment in Russia. And bridging that chasm, as it's called in the United States, is a challenge everywhere. But I think the chasm is particularly wide here in Russia. And then finally, there's a cultural problem that Russians have. Every country has a cultural difficulty with entrepreneurialism and innovation. No one's good at everything. But I have noticed one thing as I read about the challenges here. Russians hate failure. Russians are frightened of failure. Failure is frightening to the Russians, perhaps because historically failure had real consequences here. If you're not failing as an entrepreneur, you're not really trying, because most startups, most ideas fail. They don't succeed. And for Russia to truly take its part with the United States and other countries in the innovation economy, young people have to feel free to fail. So some of that's cultural, some of it's not being, scolded by their mothers when the company inevitably goes under. But there are policy elements to that as well. Companies need to be limited liability corporations where the failure of the company the bankruptcy of the company does not become the personal responsibility of the founder. Companies need to be able to go public on stock exchanges and have access to capital before they have real revenues. And this is a very different way of thinking about the commercialization of new technologies, thinking about entrepreneurialism. I have read and I believe that when the government invests in a young startup here, they ask for essentially a down payment to show that there actually is money behind the venture. That's a terrible use of a company's limited resources, and the government is essentially asking for it as a hedge against failure. So the message I would give to everyone who's watching this is failure is okay. Failure is fine. Failure shows that you're experimenting, and in your role as people who have a voice, who can drive policy change, you need to ask your officials as well to change the rules around entrepreneurialism to make failure less of a catastrophe.
Dear Mr. Pontin, thank you ever so much for answering our questions, and we hope to see you at the forum, and thank you again.
Thank you very much.